Hey y'all, it's your boy Cryptic, and today I'm here with another video comparing the PS5 to the Xbox Series X. And I think with this video we can definitively get down to the point, to the reason why each console is performing the way it is and why. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, as you all know, Control's Ultimate Edition sort of launched on PlayStation Plus for the PS5 and on Game Pass for uh, Xbox and Microsoft platforms, notably for the Series X. And the results of how Control runs on both consoles is insanely interesting, but has highlighted um, furthermore as to why it is what it is. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, recently, I'd say in the week, last week, Total Digital Foundry had done about 3 videos comparing Control on all consoles and PC. So by all consoles, I mean the new current gen consoles, Series S, Series X, PS5. For this sake, we're gonna ignore the Series S and focus primarily on the PS5 and Series X, and this will become apparent as we go through the video here. Now, Control on the current gen consoles has 2 modes: a 30 frames per second mode that has ray tracing enabled, and a 60 frames per second mode with no ray tracing. Um, on the Xbox Series X, it's 1440p resolution at 30 FPS locked, ray tracing. On the PS5, it is 1440p resolution at a locked 30 FPS with ray tracing. Let's see if you can keep up with the trend here. On the Series X, the 60 FPS mode is also at 1440p. That's 60 FPS locked. With a caveat, but it is 60 FPS locked. PS5 is also 1440p at 60 FPS locked. And both, of course, no ray tracing. This is kind of insane in the sense that you look at the specs on paper, and by all means, the Xbox Series X should be either doing higher frame rates or higher resolution, or doing those exact frame rates and resolution, and the PS5 should not be able to keep up. Again, I go back to my previous video that I will have linked in this video, probably as a card somewhere or in the eye. Teraflops and pure raw power, hardware power, do not make up the full story. Balanced hardware, optimized hardware always trumps raw power. Always does, even in PC. If you go dual GPU on a PC and you run one of the latest games on it, most demanding games, even now with dual GPUs that are barely supported even by the manufacturers Nvidia and AMD, have been leaning away from it for so long, games do not scale so well to just raw power. Sometimes, in the instances of like Cyberpunk, you can use raw power to bust through bugs and performance issues that are plaguing a game, but otherwise it's not always the answer, and in a lot of cases can be a hindrance because the hardware doesn't scale well with the software being run. Now, other than on my previous video where I said on the PS5 developers can go in and change the voltage and the power consumption between GPU and CPU depending on the scene and what frame rate and what resolution need to be achieved for the given scene, for the given game, etc. And the Xbox doesn't quite have that. It doesn't have the overclocking, doesn't have the speed boost, doesn't have the ability to underclock to maintain thermals and frequencies, etc. Digging deeper into the Zen 2/Zen 3 CPU that the PlayStation 5 has, which is really phenomenal because they more or less have a custom CPU made by AMD that takes the best parts of Zen 2 and the best parts of Zen 3 and combines it in like a Zen 2 enhanced, Zen 2.5, Zen, whatever you want to call it, a custom CPU. Now, it's not custom like the PlayStation 3 cell architecture, which was horrendous. even for first party developers who had trouble developing for it but did a great job. This is an easy to develop for platform. Again, enhanced hardware that is optimized for developers to get their coding games running easy, getting the best performance easier out of the hardware compared to the competition. The main thing that it borrows from uh, the current gen AMD CPUs is from the Zen 3, which has the Infinity Cache. Now, to try and break this down in a way that makes sense in the most layman terms, and also for those that are more up to speed and understanding of current computer technology and hardware, Infinity Cache is essentially a shared cache where data can be taken from and accessed very quickly. The whole point of the PlayStation 5's architecture, from this crazy I/O input output, the throughput of the SSD, the custom SSD, to the CPU, is the as low latency as possible. You know, no delays or the lowest delays possible to get assets drawn in, to get textures drawn in, animations drawn in, parameters drawn in instantly, which is huge. When you do that from SSD or hard drive level all the way to the CPU level, it has notable gains and performance benefits across the whole system, which is most likely why we're seeing the PlayStation 5 continue to punch above its weight no matter what anyone says about teraflops and GPU power and all that sort of stuff. It having its L3 cache, which is essentially Sony's, I guess, custom version of the Infinity Cache from Zen 3, which allows assets to be drawn instantly, the most important ones, streamed straight into the environment, is huge. Lower latency, getting higher res textures in right away without demanding the CPU to just ramp up so high to draw everything in. Everything's easy to access from there without relying too much on the GPU to, other than render the image, but also render out all the draw calls and everything. It's left up to the Zen 2.5 CPU or whatever you want to call it of the PlayStation 5. It can handle that, no problem. And as its frequency clocks up as to when it's needed to be clocked up, it can maintain those insane speeds at all times. That is huge, which explains why even with Control, and yes, it is another cross-gen sort of title, PC, PS4, Xbox One, PS5, Series X, right? But the Ultimate Edition Next Gen update, adding the ray tracing, doing the whole thing, shows that visually, between the two machines, from third-party games, you're not going to notice any difference. If you do notice anything, it's so minute, it's so tiny that unless you have digital foundries, scene analysis software to pick up frame drops and dips, you're not really going to notice it. You might notice the tearing. That's a lot more apparent in most video games on most screens, since the PS5 still doesn't support VRR, but will in an upcoming patch, which we don't know when that's coming, but when that happens, that'll be phenomenal. The Xbox Series X or the Xbox line have that, and that's a huge advantage, especially for games that have an unlocked frame rate, so they'll probably be around 45 to 50 frames. You'll notice fluctuations a lot more, tearing a lot more in that frame buffer, in that frame bracket between 40 and 50 frames per second, as opposed to 30 locked and 60 locked, because they're not really fluctuating that much, and if they are, it's 1 or 2 frames. Not that noticeable unless you're used to gaming on a PC at 120 frames per second, and it dips anything below, then you pick up on it. But otherwise, for the average gamer, it's going to be like, dude, I can't notice a difference. But that L3 cache / Infinity Cache that it has is huge. If you notice on the patent that Sony did, which they haven't really talked about it much, it hasn't been revealed like, wow, this is what it's really doing, or this is what it really is. It was patented in 2019. Now, a patent doesn't necessarily mean they've gone through with it, but it explains a lot, that as you can see, which I'll link the patent in the description box below so you can have a look at it for yourself and see the images and the files. But other than each core having its own cache and um, them having an L2 cache that's shared as well between the first four cores and the second four cores, and then an L3 unified cache, which is the infinity cache, air quotes here, that all of them have access to. Reducing latency to as little as possible has clearly been the goal for Sony here with the PlayStation 5. Now, to talk about the 60 frames per second mode on the Xbox Series X, there are um, stutters, major stutters. Frame rate wise between the two, they're very similar. Um, but for whatever reason, the frame timing on the Xbox Series X is a lot worse at 60 FPS mode compared to the PS5. It's unknown why at the moment. Digital Foundry mentioned it, and they're like, it's a bit weird. The PS5 seems way smoother in that sense because it's one of those sort of things where you do notice a stutter because it's more of like a like a millisecond pause of the game and then it continues on. It's almost like hitching, freezing up, which is a bit weird. It's similar to I guess what happened with Assassin's Creed Valhalla pre-patch, and then after the patch it just improved a lot more. The tearing disappeared, VRR support, all that sort of stuff. So could be with a future patch on the Xbox that'll go away, but frame rate wise, from scene to scene, they're pretty much dead on the same. They did bring up a mode where if you go to photo mode, it shows that the Xbox Series X has a higher frame rate, and the PS5 has a lower frame rate. It could be how photo mode is technically handled on both systems is slightly different. And again, you're sort of in a still in a moment in a 3D environment. It doesn't really pertain much where you don't have actually animations happening. Particle effects are frozen in time, so the animation isn't continuing, and animations and quality of animations and the resolution of animations hit frame rate and performance as well, just as much as textures loading in, models loading in, etc. Things in motion are a lot more taxing than things that are stationary, not moving. Um, so I wouldn't really use that part of their analysis um, to really determine the main gap between the two consoles. I mean, it could just mean that due to the reliance on GPU power in photo mode, as the Series X has a more powerful GPU compared to the PS5, it gets a higher frame rate in photo mode. But who's playing games in photo mode? Really, it's more just take the picture of your scene, edit the scene how you want it, take your photo or screenshot, save it, post it, whatever. But we're playing games in motion, so that's where you gotta take the performance and in motion both. No, no, identical despite the GPU. You could say that if it was unlocked for 60 and 30 unlocked, the Xbox would potentially outperform the PS5. But then that brings up other caveats. If you were to unlock it, what issues would you have on the Series X? You could potentially have those same issues with the PS5. So that's why I decided, hey, they equally run, as the game runs perfectly well on both systems, regardless of the hardware. Let's just lock that at 30 and 60 for the two different modes, ray tracing and non-ray tracing, and get the best experience for the gamers on both platforms, which is great. But yeah, that's pretty much it. The PS5 continues to sort of keep up with the Series X and outperform depending on third-party titles. But as you know, guys, when it comes to them finally bringing out their big guns, their first-party titles, that's where both platforms are going to shine. Performance-wise, third-party, there's no difference. Third-party games are all going to look good. I'll be honest with you, if any third-party title game looks bad on either console, I would say that's down to the developers not optimizing and not developing the game properly for the console, and not really either console's fault. I know we like to talk about which console performs better in a sort of fanboyish war between the two. Let's stay out of that crap. It's absolute bullshit. At the end of the day, none of us have shares in any of these businesses, and if we did, it wouldn't matter. Um, we're here as the consumers, and we, as gamers, we deserve to have the best possible performance for all these games because we're paying our hard-earned money. Whether it's $60 or $70 in the States, or $90 to $120 here in Australia. You're paying your hard-earned money for the games. It should run properly on whichever console you have. And if one just chugs like crazy and it's not really the hardware's fault, which this isn't like the PS4 and Xbox One generation of past, where the Xbox One was that underpowered compared to the PlayStation 4, where games from day one and even towards the end of the life cycle, never really caught up. It never really had a chance, and developers did their best. Here we're seeing that both are running 60 frames per second. It's been ages since any consoles did that. We're getting 30 frames per second with ray tracing, and now even games like with the Spider-Man games and hopefully many other games, and Microsoft does that too with their first-party titles, where we can have 60 frames per second with ray tracing. That's ideal. Hit that sweet spot between fidelity and performance, and I think as more gamers get into 60 frames per second gaming, they will realize that is the better way to play. Because once you switch over to 30, yes, with enough, 10 or 15 minutes time, your eyes will adjust and your brain will adapt to the lower FPS. But as soon as you switch back to 60, you'll be like, that is the way to play. It is so butter smooth, so accurate. Latency in input and response time is so low. It's so great. It's the best way to play. But yeah, guys, that's essentially it. That's why the PS5 continues to punch above its weight. But does it really matter? No, because both consoles should be performing absolutely great because they are monster of consoles. I mean, if you look at the hardware of both of these machines and try to build an equivalent PC that can do what they do, it's impossible, especially at the price range. If you're capping it at the price range of what these are worth and you try to do that on the PC end, you're not really going to be doing any ray tracing. Maybe you'll get 45, 50 frames on low to medium settings, not on some of the settings that, especially as more and more of these developers reveal the PC equivalent settings for what the game's running at, you realize that unless you've got a top tier machine, you're not going to achieve, better or equal to frame rates. Not to say that PC is worse than consoles, but these machines really are fantastic value for the money. So yeah, guys, I will catch you in the next video. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to be notified for any future videos and content to be posted on the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time. See you guys.